Brendan, thank you for coming on Harpinion. Harpinion is a new show that we're trying to introduce into the gaming industry, which is about gaming and politics. What we're trying to do here is basically answer questions that a lot of us are asking ourselves, but not necessarily get an answer on. So it's going to be a bit, political, but it's also going to be, about our experiences and what people can learn from it.
It's a pleasure to be on, and obviously, we've known each other for some time. Politics has always been and always will be my first love, so let's get after it.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, let's talk a little bit about your history. I mean, my personal history, some of the, listeners and viewers will not know, but I originally was active in what we call the Young Republican Party in the Netherlands, which, according to American standard, is like, sitting in the middle, right? It doesn't really, it's a Republican side. It doesn't, really
We don't
hit
have a middle in
the
America
Democratic
anymore.
side.
You're either one way or the other, so.
Exactly. So Mark Rutte was one that I was with in the Young Republican Party, and he is now the Secretary General of NATO and obviously in the news on a continuous basis. So quite interesting. I mean, in all my experiences in the gaming industry and all of the different activities I've undertaken and businesses started, rarely was I able to avoid politics. And that makes it so interesting. So please, give me a little bit of an introduction on where you come from, and especially since you're in the UAE right now, because I'm catching you at a very interesting time, and I want to talk a lot about that, obviously. Maybe we can just share some of those views.
No, absolutely. Well, as I said, politics has and always will be my first love. And it's one that I learned at a very early age, as you so eloquently talked about, that politics is involved in everything. Like it or not, it's a necessary evil to understand and deal with and navigate along the way. And whether that's being from doing political campaigns, you know, dating back as far as I can remember, I'm sitting here thinking back to working on governor and senatorial and other campaigns. I think as early as I was 12 along the way, and probably before that, running my first race still while I was in high school for a statewide city council race that then turned into a mayor, um, and then running a congressional race. After going into sports for a while and having another one of my true loves of sports, along with politics, and spending 8 great years at the Nebraska football program that I did, as I always like to say, when we won. And that's college football, not European football or professional football, because football's football. The politics of football alone off of that. But dealing with politics around the globe now, whether it be here where I'm at in the UAE as we're recording this right now, to Japan, to the US, to Brazil, to everywhere else in between, or I've navigated on behalf of the gaming industry accordingly.
Yeah. Coming back, I mean, you were talking about being at the age of 12. I remember I was always interested in American politics for some reason. At that time, I didn't know why, right? I'm a Dutch guy, don't even speak English, but I got a lot of news. And,
I don't
at
speak
the age of
English either. I speak American, so
12, I was defending. Yeah, well, you can say the same about myself. I was defending President Carter very much at that time, and it's interesting how he basically went from let's say his one-time presidency to more of a symbol of basically how politics should be played, and it's far from where we are today. So when we start looking at what's happening in the UAE, it is all politics, isn't it? Because right now, everybody is saying, how can the UAE allow in Ras Al Khaimah a casino, considering the fact that it's a Muslim country and that it's quite conservative and that it's very far from, let's say, the let's say general attitude of laissez-faire, and therefore entertainment and gaming should be allowed. So what's your view on that whole, let's say, development that we're on, that's happening right now?
well, I think obviously what is happening in the UAE is from an industry perspective very spectacular. And I say that saying this is a portion of the world that for those of us that have been in this industry for a significant amount of time when we were all two, since we'll say decades along the way, that we never thought it would happen over here. But, over the course of the last 2, 3 years, you've had a regulator come to fruition in the GCGRA. You've subsequently have them launch a national lottery. You have a online presence that's in its early stages and still in its testing phase. And then obviously you have a resort that will open up in the first part of 2027 up in Ras Al Khaimah that definitely changed the playing field when it was announced back in 2022 that was coming to the UAE. You bring up the politics of this, and obviously the politics of the GCC is very unique. And I say that from the standpoint of even though you have synergies between a lot of the countries over here, and how they act and work together, and what has been, various economic drivers, currently oil, or I would say, oil predominantly, with the UAE definitely over the last 2 decades taking a very I'm going to use the term progressive stance in how it looks at the world of opening up to tourism and opening up and having business friendly climates, and looking to diversify into AI and other unique digital avenues to be able to do that. And I think adding a gaming element to that in a very tourism based economy, at one of the epicenters of airports here in Dubai, and a country that I can be in Abu Dhabi in an hour and a half. I can be up in Iraq in an hour, where have a solid base that is also driven not only by tourists but by expats that live here, that diversifying the economy and offering an acceptable form of entertainment to a lot of the world became a natural progression over time.
Yeah, I mean, from a logical perspective, I agree with everything that you say, obviously, and understanding the situation a little bit and looking at that 90% of the Emiratis are effectively, or people living in the Emiratis are not Emirati, so therefore you have a massive captive market, you have a very large number of Asians who obviously like to play, as well as you have a large number of Europeans, Russians, Ukrainians, and many others that like to play. So, that is all very logical. But I'm still trying to get my head around the fact that effectively the Emirates is made up of 7 Emirates. The major Emirat, the chairman of the Emiratis is Abu Dhabi, right? And generally they have been far more conservative than Dubai has been. And Ras Al Khaimah has been, well, I mean, they're trying to fight for, let's say, their, let's say, advantage, right? Whatever that advantage might be. And in this case, I think they're absolutely right with the expansion of Dubai, Sharjah in the middle, and the fact that the highways are just fantastic. It's quite an easy drive, as you said, an hour and a half, to get there from wherever you are in Dubai. And that makes it, really attractive to, draw the people. But what does that mean politically, and how come that the GCGRA has, let's say, been filled with effectively foreigners? And does that mean that they ultimately decide, or is it still somebody above them? So, I have a lot of questions related to, let's say, how that is to work.
Well, and I think, obviously, when the GCGRA came into play in September of 23, you saw them implement a board, and obviously a expat driven senior team to be able to do that. And I think, in a lot of aspects, they're some of the best people to answer on how all those inner workings came to be, over all that. But, being that, the UAE has always relied on how best do we do this if we're going into a new market, and understanding how we can collaborate with other people throughout the world to say, let's figure out a way to move this forward. and get the best people and the brightest people in the room to be able to do that. And I think that, you're seeing that of going, how do we build a better environment to be able to do this? And that you're going to have, one of the largest resorts to be built since Marina Bay Sands some uh, 15 plus years ago, in being able to do that, and obviously advance things in other ways. So, it's bringing all those people together in a collaborative atmosphere, no different than you see with what's happening with digital assets and stable coins, what's happening with AI. The unique thing, and why I always appreciate the UAE more than anything, is it is truly a very diverse group of people that live here. I mean, you can walk down the street, as I've done in my time here, and it's not just people from the GCC, but as you talked about different people that are here, you've got Europeans here, you've got Africans here, you've got various parts of Asia. Asia always gets lumped into, the Far East versus, but you've got Indians and Pakistanis and Chinese and everybody else in between. It is truly a diverse melting pot of cultures and ideas, and that's what makes this place so great.
What I really like about it is that they often come in with a particular vision, right? And their vision is like, okay, this is what we want to do. Then indeed they get, let's say, the expertise around it, and basically start working with that expertise in order to see what's really possible. But again, going to my question, does that basically mean that the, let's say, decision maker, and let's say the, are they in truly in charge, or are they basically guiding the process, and the powers, let's say, in the background are just extremely sensible in taking a lot of that advice and move on? Is that what we're seeing? And where will that lead to? Because right now, obviously, it's not open yet. So it's going to be quite interesting to go through a number of experiences in order then to start to understand what actually is the impact, what are the challenges, and how will then the powers react to, let's say, the developments.
Well, I think they've already taken a thoughtful approach, and I think you've seen that with the launch of a national lottery, and the thoughtful approach they took to that. That's now been a year plus, in being able to do that. So I think there's very much of a thoughtful process with, and I say this from a standpoint is there's a distinct nationalism here, whether that be from the Emiratis or anybody else that lives here, and pride in the UAE. So I think it's very much like I stated earlier, it's very collaborative in what that is, and I think you'll see a very thoughtful approach from the GCGRA and its leadership as these things continue to roll out to get things up and going in a very UAE way, to say we want the best and brightest doing this, and have the best over the top type thing and being able to do it, that becomes a model for everybody else to follow.
Are we going to see one casino? Are we going to see one casino per emirate? Are we going to see multiple casinos? Are we going to see a Las Vegas in Ras Al Khaimah? What are we going to see?
Obviously, I think you've got the one right now that is, opening up next year. There have been rumors along the way of, hey, this is going to happen and that's going to happen. I've always viewed this market, when I first started looking at it, as, 2 to 3 is what makes sense. Maybe that ends up being 4, maybe that ends up only being 2, but that's sort of where I think things lie. Where things come together, obviously we'll say, okay, what's best in each emirate as they look at it, and how
Right.
they distinctly go about that, and saying, hey, do we want one of these in Dubai? Do we want one of these in Abu Dhabi? There are some options of how that would work, and where do you place it, and those types of things. But you see that in a very diverse way of what's happening today, not just, you think of Dubai and the real estate and everything that happens here today, and the recent announcement of expanding DIFC to make it one of the world's financial centers. Mirroring that with, Walt Disney World coming to Abu Dhabi, in the near
Yeah.
future, and its placement in and around Yas Island. So you definitely see world cultures coming together here in very diverse environments, and they take a very proactive approach of how do we need to blend this all together, and how do we need to make it all work along the way to make sure it all blends.
Yeah. I mean, looking at Rosh and let's say their plan, right? It's not just opening up one large casino and let's say, take advantage of that. They're big investors themselves, right? I mean, they own, over half, right? I'm just trying to understand, for example, Wynn didn't have a license from the moment they basically started to um, make, build the concept, right? They always said that they wanted to have a casino, but they already started building without the license yet. Am I correct? Or did they get the license way in advance? Or they just got, let's say, comfort around the commitment that they would get the license?
I'd have to go.
Because that was a little bit different, right? Than
Well,
normally was the case.
and I don't know if I'd say it was a little bit different, but I want to go back to one point that I was going to go to that I think that is highlighted. Is that yes, there is one uh, casino being developed up there right now, and what that looks like, but there is obviously a lot of support that is going into that to make that work. And I say that saying there is additional hotel development, there is additional housing development. There is a tremendous amount of other things that have been a catalyst that has allowed RAC to grow, whether that be with, office development and other things along the way, and that being with RAC Central and some of those things to be able to and very eloquently develop an emirate in and around one catalyst that has spurred other sectors and other industries to go. I
It's almost
think.
like building a Mississippi, in the middle of nowhere, and then have a massive, effect coming from it.
Well, I mean, if you think about it and you think, okay, well, not only do you have to support the thousands of workers that are on site every day, but you're going to have thousands of employees just for this facility. Those people have to have a place to live. They have to have a place to eat. They have to have a place for their schools, their health care, all of those various things along the way. And, if you don't have those resources in place today, you've got to figure out a way to put it in place. And subsequently, in building a further destination and being able to do this, not everybody is going to be able to stay at Win or necessarily wants to stay at Win. They may want to go, hey, I want to go to the casino, but I'm going to go stay down the way because I don't want to be in the center of it. I want to be somewhere else along the way in being able to do this. So it's very much of a, how many other brands can come in there, and obviously there's a tremendous amount that are coming in there over the course of time, but you've also got existing brands in the Waldorf and everything else.
What really, really impresses me with regards to the Emirati thinking is that, they think large. They think in general, what exactly, are the businesses that are going to follow this business? It's not like we stick to this business, we expect everybody to drive here from Dubai, and that's where we leave it. They actually they want to build much more around it in order to make sure that it's a complete full story. And I think that is what makes it so incredibly interesting. And obviously what MGM is trying to build in Japan, which you know a lot about, versus what's now happening with regards to Rashaheim, right, where you're going to get an incredibly powerful, let's say, project or let's say development that is just going to have so much else coming from it, and I think that makes it, very very different. Correct?
It is very different, and I think putting it in terms of what MGM is doing with Japan, it is somewhat of a good comparison. And I say that saying, MGM, when MGM Osaka opens in 2030 ish, around the time there, granted they are building their facility, but they're going to have to bring all the support that's part of it. Now, whether that not only be infrastructure that exists over on Yumashima that they need to enhance, partially that's been enhanced because of what happened with World Expo and being able to do that, and they're trying to figure out how to repurpose those portions along the way. But it's looking at the entire ecosystem and going, how do we need to do it? But I think back to the UAE and Ras Al Khaimah, this is where they've taken a very thoughtful approach of saying, okay, let's do this bigger, let's do this bold, let's look at this as the whole region does. In doing that, and I say that saying, I guarantee when Disney gets done in Abu Dhabi, it'll be the best Disney park ever built. You have the best Atlantis that's been built. You look at even the office parks and that sort of stuff and the road infrastructure. They'll take and say, hey guys, this is going to be 6 months worth of pain, but by the time we're done, we're going to enhance and improve your commute by whatever. And it actually
Yeah.
works, stuff in the United States that we can't ever think of, and nor if we did, it'd take us 5 years and we'd still have it screwed up because we don't look at things that way. But that's where this region just looks at things differently and does it in a very
But
thoughtful and meaningful way.
yeah, but let's get back to the politics. I mean, that's quite
Yeah.
an Emirati approach. That's not necessarily, and it's somewhat of a GCC approach, but the rest of the GCC is far more conservative, is in generally more careful, other than Saudi Arabia, with, for example, Niam and a few other of the other projects. But in generally, I mean, what Dubai did right from so many years ago when there was no example, there was no example in the world for
You
that
go
matter.
back to I think it was '04 when Freehold came into play, and it was, hey, we're going to figure out how to do this and open up our economy to be able to do it. It was very forward
Yeah.
thinking.
Yeah, and that makes it so interesting. So now I want to ask you a question that is, not necessarily related to Ras Al Khaimah today, but I have a particular thought, and tell me, how right or wrong I am related to, let's say, the involvement that the Emiratis had in Yemen. Okay, they pulled out. They originally were asked by Saudi Arabia to get involved. They pulled out. And what I understand is that the reason they got involved in the first place is they were afraid that the southern part of Saudi Arabia would be overrun and would start hitting the borders of the Emiratis. Now, is that something that, for example, could indeed have happened, or that is, creating some kind of a, let's say, because the Emiratis have the strongest military of the Middle East, right? They're far stronger than the Saudis, they're far stronger than Qatar. And they basically train their people proper. People have to go in the army in the Emiratis. People have to, basically serve. They have to, yeah, as you said, they're nationalistic. You mentioned it
Yes.
earlier. All of this to me feels like they really know what they want to accomplish, and they also have a feel of how to protect it. And I think that is essential considering the location of Ras Al Khaimah, with regards to, making that happen. Am I way off, or do you
No, I,
agree?
I think I think you very much, in a nutshell, cover how leadership within the region works. And I say that saying, obviously, the UAE has been a leader to say, hey, we're going to be the beacon off of this and be able to do this. But you've seen other countries like KSA say, hey, we also are a player here, and not that we're a small player, because they're not. And what they are doing in taking the lead from what UAE has done with Freehold, with other major developments, and even with sporting events like what you saw with the World Cup that was in Doha, and elsewhere 4 years ago.
Yeah,
I had to think about the going, it's in the US this year. And I was like, oh, it was only 4 years ago that I was watching the World Cup while here. And I could have gone to the match, but I didn't. But I should have at the time. Maybe I'll get to go in the US this year, depending on if I'm there.
yeah.
But you'll see that in Saudi Arabia. But back to guarding, if you want to call, and protecting the overall infrastructure. The GCC works very well together, even though it has very much diverse things that are happening with that. And I say that saying, you look at the larger area, you've got, some areas just off on the other side of the Arabian Gulf that are, not so friendly areas in Iran. But they
Especially right
all,
now. Exactly.
it's been that way for several months. But I think it's, hey, we're all going to look after our own, for those of us that want to be able to keep the peace here, and being able to say, how do we keep the way of life going the way we like it, to be able to do that. And I think that's one of the other things that a lot of people don't appreciate, is, even so much as, and growing up, in a Cold War era where it was the Americans versus the Soviets and that sort of stuff. you also have a region here that gets along with both sides very well, and that's why you've seen the peace talks trying to happen here, whether it be with Ukraine and other things along the way, of bringing those unique forces together that, 50 years ago, 30 years ago would have happened in Europe that are now happening in Abu Dhabi.
Yeah, they're very pragmatic about it. I mean, if you think about, how the oil states, came about, and let's say how the oil originally was, pumped by, the British and the, well, Shell, the Dutch somewhat, and
Yeah.
then the Americans, of course.
No,
But
and I think obviously the oil economy transferred, from the pearl economy and some of these types of
yeah,
things along the way, in being able to do that. So they've also been very forward thinking and sometimes very quick to react over what they needed to do to keep things moving economically as things have transitioned from the pearl trade to an oil economy to now what I think will end up being, as things continue down the oil path. And I say that saying, most people say, oh, all they do is have gas guzzlers here and everything else. And yeah, there are still gas cars here, but there's a number of electric cars. And
yeah,
you can
no, I mean,
easily go to a parking garage and see Teslas and everything else parked. So it's not like they're adverse to the whole thing over it is. Um, but they're very thoughtful in going, unlike I remember a conversation I had here probably 3 years ago, which was Brendan, why is your country so dumb that thinks it can go electric in 5 years? And they were absolutely right. We couldn't transform the electric ever to go electric over everything because we don't have the generation power, we don't have the grid potential, we don't have anything else infrastructure wise. That's where countries like, where I sit today are very progressive in saying, you know what, guys, the world's going to change. Let's figure out how we adapt with it. And we're ahead of the curve, so we're prepared. We still know what we have as far as resources today, but how do we need to plan for the future and what transportation looks like and other things along the way? I mean, that's why I think you'll see the first, robo taxis here because, the things that we promised, when we were kids of, hey, we'd have flying cars and everything else has finally come to fruition. And one of the first places you're likely to see it's here.
yeah, and when you start looking at the example that they give, right, with the way they spent the money. I mean, if Russia had done the same thing under Putin, starting when he came to power in the year 2000, when he was making money hand over fist, the Russian economy could have been completely de-oiled as such, or create a much less dependency upon the oil, etc. They tried it through gaming, etc. I was heavily involved in that project at a certain part of my life, but looking at it now and looking at, for example, other countries, Equatoria, Guinea, when you start looking at a country like that, I mean, they could fulfill a massive, interesting role in Africa in order to become a tourist destination. But again, they're squandering it because of the fact that, it's so dictatorial. And what I've always been impressed with, despite the fact that you have, an autocratic government in most of the GCCs, they're still thinking for the bettering of the people in general, right? So there is enough to go around if you do things right. There's very little to go around if you just think of your own pocket, right? It seems like that type of story.
They are very thoughtful in their approach of saying, look, we can all get along here, and I want to see everybody else improve along the way. Because as you said, there's enough of the pie for that to happen accordingly. Which is why I've always said if you just want to live a great life and play by the rules, this is the place to come. You'll survive and you'll thrive.
Exactly. And will you see, therefore, let's say this multiply into, the Middle East? I mean, originally we thought, because really they were one of the first countries to make peace with Israel, right? As an Arab nation with regards to opening up, its full, flight path and borders. And let's say, making it possible for the Jewish to establish themselves in the UAE, etc. They've done, and taken a hell of an initiative, and Trump won. One of the few things that I'm absolutely in favor of that he did. But when I start looking at let's say Saudi Arabia has a far more complex situation, right? It's more conservative, etc. But on one side they're building and building and building, and then they're building Neon, where they want to really move a lot of foreigners into, etc. Kind of a UAE, Dubai type model. But then on the other side, they've never mentioned anything related to, any entertainment or whatever. So, a lot of people are still like, I went to Saudi Arabia a few times over the last couple of years. I was extremely impressed with the openness and the changes within the country. And I'd say to anybody, I mean, it is worth just having a holiday in Saudi Arabia, even though everybody might think like, no way. But it is really something in order to see a culture that is so different, to travel around in so easily, because they make it quite easy and it's safe. But at the same token, I don't think it's going to go for gaming, right?
I say never. And I'm not saying that they're going to tomorrow over everything, but I think, you bring up a very valid point. Initially, that was a lot of the catalyst for being able to do what you're seeing today, and that's in the Abraham Accords that are now, we're going on 5 6 years of that initial framework, and I think you'll continually see that to expand. Obviously, there's been talk of that along the way, and how that plays into a KSA and those types of things. I think it'll be very interesting to watch and how that plays out because, does that mean more openness? Does that mean more accepting of other religions and cultures and that? And I say that saying, you know, I always, when I say to friends of mine back in the States and elsewhere that, when I meet up with, and I have friends of all different cultures and religions here, of going to a kosher restaurant in Dubai, and they're like, they have kosher restaurants in Dubai, and I'm like, yeah. They
Really?
it's there's plenty. I can tell you where
Yeah,
several of
exactly.
them are. But the thought of that in general of saying you have a kosher restaurant in an Arab country, people sort of have to do the double take along the way and go, okay, that doesn't make sense, but I guess it does. But that's where this is why this is such a unique and exceptional place because they understand the different cultures and so much as what you've seen recently in Abu Dhabi with the House of Abraham, the Abrahamic house, where you have a synagogue and a mosque and a church all in one facility, so you celebrate faiths of all the world in one building.
Yeah.
There's very few places ever in the world, I think, you come to that to say, hey, I've got this. And, it's just down the street from a Louvre and a Guggenheim and the National Museum and, the cultural center of the country to be able to embrace all those things.
You know what I've been very impressed with the whole area. Number one, it's not a gigantic, economy, right? So if we set up China and we set up, let's say the United States, and then somewhat Russia in the middle, especially from a land size perspective, not necessarily economically. But if you then compare that and you then look at the power of the GCC, or take UAE, by itself, you then think of autocratic leadership. Autocratic leadership normally, you know, basically is being viewed as the rules are according to what the ruler says they are. They're not logical. So the world order principles don't work. Actually, they work better in the GCC than they work in many other democracies as well in the larger countries. So for me, the GCC is basically setting a bit of an example. I'm hoping that they stay on this track, right? Because let's be honest, I mean, they're still autocratic and they could change, right? We've seen it at MBS, right? MBS has made drastic changes that in a normal democracy could have never happened, so overnight. But to me, that makes it so interesting, as is what's happening with gaming, 𝗖𝗧𝗡𝗧𝗧, etc. And the rulers backing of it. I am, very impressed as long as I feel that they keep that world order, mechanism going, right? Because effectively, it's one of the few examples in the world that functions as such, and that helps and that shows us a path forward for the betterment of all.
Well, you bring up a very valid point on that, and I also think back to, the last real group that did this in an effective way was the Singaporeans, which,
Yeah,
while they do have a republic, it's not your typical republic that you
with a
see
party
out
that has
there.
been running since the foundation. No.
Yes, 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 yes. Um, it's very much of, that benevolency that exists there in things that you would never see in the republic like that exists in the United States. And I say that saying, let me put on my traditional US hat of, oh, we can't do that with gaming because I'm going to lose the next election because, my conservative base of churchgoers, or my, far left base of you're preying on the poor, is going to say, I voted for something horrible and I need to get out. And you get these politicians that get weak kneed, you know, it's hard to encapsulate that you'd ever be able to do such a development like you've seen in Singapore, like you're seeing in UAE, in a very thoughtful way in the States at this point, unless you have a group that just says, hey, we're going to go about it and do it the right way, because they either overtax it or they're too chicken to do the full thing out the right way to begin with, because, they're conserved about a base. But as I would say in the US, find me somebody that's actually lost their election because of gaming, and you're going to be hard pressed to find somebody, because no one ever has.
Well, exactly. I mean, that's one area. The other area is the fact that anytime we elect somebody, we elect them on the basis of them taking, I don't know what, 100 decisions over the 4 years. And, 1, 2, 3, 5, I mean, 20, 30 of those decisions we don't agree with. So, I think people are coming to terms with the fact that it was always a more acceptable principle that there was a give and take, and we would talk about it. Now it seems like it's a give and take, but I take, and I try to give as little as possible, and I try to, just push my way through. And I think that's where, again, going back to the principles of, creating a bit of an orderly system, taking in, let's say, the know-how from the international community, listening to, let's say, what experts have to say, understanding as to where they could move it into, is, in my view, a very commendable, right, effort of what they're undertaking. So the fact that you're heavily in there. You were originally doing some work, I believe, for the GCGRA, right? So it's interesting how they get all of these different interests aligned in order to make it work.
They do a very good job with that, and obviously, and I haven't done anything specifically worth the GCGRA from their side of life over everything, but definitely from a commercial side of working with operators and suppliers to through their process here, and being able to do that. But you're very eloquent in saying that it's, how do I get the right people in the room to make stuff happen? I
Yeah.
think that's the best way to summarize it. And whether that be, gaming as we're talking about here, to, what do we need to do to bring Disney here? I mean, that was, when that was announced roughly about a year ago, that was a huge deal, because
Yeah.
it sat here and said, okay, we've got Disney, from a US perspective in Anaheim and Orlando, and you've had it in Tokyo, and you've had it in Shanghai, and you've had it in
And Hong
Paris,
Kong.
and Hong Kong. And
Yeah.
then now all of a sudden you filled the gap in the middle, which was always sort of like, okay, what does this mean? Like, every stereotype you may have about this region gets thrown out, because, you have, as I've said, such a diverse melting pot of people and cultures, where, I remember when I first started coming here and people would say they'd give both backgrounds, and it was typically somewhere from this portion of the world and somewhere in Europe. It's like, I'm French Tunisian, and I'm in America I'm just a mutt.
But America was always leading with being the melting pot of the world,
Yeah.
until it got broken down, in Trump 1, etc. And it was like, it was the pride. I mean, I personally, having lived in the United States, I was very proud of, let's say, how the US dealt with it. I sold it to virtually anybody everywhere I went. I mean, I've operated in many countries, and every time I operated, they say, let's look at the basic principles of what it takes in order to make things happen. And the Americans always led in that. They were very good at, hiring the right project managers, hiring the right product managers, basically understanding the marketing around it, basically understanding the business principles around it, and making it possible to run that way.
I think it's one of those that, um you know America, as much as I still love it, we've screwed up our own policies and thought process off of that for a host of reasons. And while I still think the core of America still exists there, and being a melting pot and saying, hey, we're going to do things and look at things in the right way, you continually see things that get thrown up that make things get exemplified and start the political battles out there that call for the divisiveness that we are now as a country, that you've seen just the back and forth, especially over the last 10, 20 years, that you really didn't see before, dating back to, whether it be from Carter to Reagan and Reagan into Bush and Bush into Clinton, that you didn't, you had that nice sort of ebb and flow, and we kept in the middle, and now we're sort of in more of the up and down swings.
Switching a little bit, if I would have to, determine if this project is going to be successful, it's very much going to be dependent upon nothing nasty, it's going to happen, right? And I've always said, which was interesting because I was there when you had the shooting. This was about how many years ago? This was just before COVID, right? When you had the shooting and at that festival, Mandalay Bay. When things started to happen, a threat like that could shut down, the appetite for people of having gaming, right? We haven't spoken about Thailand. You and I know a lot about the situation in Thailand at the moment. It is being viewed as, not that it's not welcome, but I don't think that the last word has been said on that yet. But for the time being, I would like to really say it is such an experiment and such an important experiment because gaming is happening anyhow, right? If we look at all legal gaming around the world, there's still more illegal gaming than legal gaming in total. Now, if people start considering how much money the different governments earn on, let's say, the legal gaming today, and we're just tossing away half, of that, if not more, by just not taxing it, by not regulating it, etc., in so many different countries, etc. I'm just looking for ways where, gaming is going to find good examples like this, where it is a clear privilege for the operators to be in that position and to make sure that everything goes right. And that as a result, it just helps society as a whole.
There's definitely, I'm going to even say, a battle within the industry right now
Yeah.
of, what's regulated, what's not regulated, what's gray, what's pre-regulated, which is the new buzz term out there, in looking at this. But I think it's very much of, there are opportunities to do this right. And as I remember, as you said that, I was thinking back to a conversation I had with a reporter of, one of the things that they always had a problem explaining to their editors was about suitability and understanding who had the right, if you want to call it that, to game, which is not a right but a privilege, of being able to say, hey, I'm going to do this. I'm going to do this in the right, respectable way, and do this in a fair way that takes me through a process where I'm licensed, where I do all these things and do it. And there is tremendous opportunities, you said, to be able to do that in the right way in all these places around the world, whether that be in the U.S., whether that be in Thailand, if they were ever to go down this path, what you're seeing in other places along the way, to say, okay, what's the right way to do it? Is there a way to do a reasonable amount of tax revenue for a local entity to be able to redirect that, as you've seen with tribes that have thrived off of gaming in the U.S. and how it has made a difference in their communities for healthcare and education,
Yeah.
to be able to do that? And some of the same things are going, okay, hey, we have a need here to be able to do this. What do we need to do to generate things for education like you see in the States off of these things? What do we need to do for you know, childhood related education or healthcare or anything else along the way to help, facilitate some of the needs and be able to do that in a reasonable fashion? Now, you can't overtax it, you can't overdo all the things along the way, but how can I recoup those dollars that aren't in a regulated market today? You're absolutely right. That's what needs to be the conversation. But the problem is, in some cases, some people just don't want to have that conversation because they want to stay saying, I'm in the unregulated 100% goes to me market, and I'm going to skirt the way. Or there's those that sit there and say, I want to do this the right way. I go ask Mother May I in being able to do it, which is the world I've lived in, for the 20 some years I've been involved in this industry, where if the regulator tells me no, I can't go down the path,
Right.
versus other people that are sort of like, yeah, we'll wait for the regulator to tell us no, and we'll see what happens along the way. And maybe they come after us, maybe they don't, but we'll take the risk. And, For those of us that want to do it the right way, it's a little hard to see that.
Exactly. Coming back, as we have been, speaking for quite a bit, what are some of the fantastic memories that you have from this industry, being in this industry, something that you're really proud of and something that you really feel that you can support versus, let's say, the things that you don't like as much?
I think about that, and being the kid from Nebraska that I am, they ever say I'd be able to travel the world and do what I'm doing today is.
I always say I come from the Nebraska and the Netherlands, so I love that statement.
I don't know if anybody wants to claim they're from the Nebraska of anywhere other than me. And I say that taking, I take great pride in my corn brethren and being the beef capital of the world. And we still have the best beef, but as it relates back to this, being able to go back and say I've gotten to be able to travel the globe, doing gaming, and some of the sports stuff I do and other things, been pretty remarkable just in general. But in the 20 some years I've been in this industry, obviously, one of the things I would be remiss in is the gaming licenses that I was a part of in garnering for Las Vegas Sands when I worked for them, both in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania and Singapore. But then obviously, what's going on in the UAE and being involved in this emerging market along the way. As you well know, from your history, very seldom do you get to be on the front side of so many emerging markets as you get to do this.
Exactly.
And being able to do this on a major scale of seeing what happened in Singapore and what a fruitful endeavor that has been for Singapore. And you have a building there that has become a national image.
Yeah.
People used to take pictures of the Merlion and don't think that they still don't because they do. But now it's, I've got to have my picture by Marina Bay Sands and I've got to have that in the background. You're seeing obviously a transformation in what's happening in the UAE with gaming and how that's going to progress. So I've been very fortunate in the things I've been able to do. And as I always say to everybody, I'm not done. And that should be a warning sign out there to some people to say, where's the next one at? What's he up to? Along the way. But I still got one or two of these left in me before I'm calling it a day.
Excellent. Well, I love to hear that. I'm not going to call it a day for a very long time either, but what I would like to do is get more knowledge, from people like yourself.
I'm far from seeing this being done because, as most people will attest to, I'll probably die doing this in some form or fashion. I'll be the guy you wake up on the plane and somehow I just don't wake up after how many decades more from here, type thing. But I appreciate the conversation today. I think you're absolutely right that people need to understand, each time it's not about reinventing the wheel. Let's look what works, let's work what doesn't work and figure out the best way where it works individually in that location. Because it's not a one size fits all wheel, but the wheel's still round and it still works the way it's supposed to. But, how can we glean from experiences to make it work? But, this is something that people don't always understand the politics of the situation. And, whether it be the politics of the US or the UAE or Europe or Japan or Thailand, they're all unique, they're all different, but that becomes the root of how this all works to make it fruitful in the end or why it didn't work in the end. And right now we're seeing that with Thailand.
I definitely would like you back on the show in order to discuss Thailand.
Let me know when. Look forward to the next conversation.
Well, I mean, in February, we're going to have the first elections. We're going to see what type of government comes in.
You have two major elections in Eastern Asian countries between Thailand and Japan, and it all becomes IR centric.
Absolutely, and that's extremely interesting. So again, it hits the point home in the sense of that. There is a clear connection, and if people can elect a leader because they're pro or against abortion, or they can elect a leader because of other principles, so are the principles for gaming, but then much bigger, right? From an economic perspective, from a emotional perspective, and from a social perspective.
It's one that people just need to understand that then in the end, if you have the right goals and public policy objectives at the center of it, it will all work out. You just got to get rid of the minutia on the other side, on the outside and the fringe to find the clear path forward.
Great. Well said. Thank you very much. And I look forward to the next show.
Absolutely. Thank you, my friend. Talk soon.
Harpinion brings candid conversations with leaders and experts shaping gaming's political and regulatory future. Follow or visit harpinion.com for more episodes and updates.